It's said that in order to stay spiritually alive, you need to fall in love at least 3 times a day. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're sitting there thinking, if I fell in love 3 times a day, that just might threaten some of my significant relationships. But I would submit to you that there are enough monarch butterflies, there are enough cactus wrens, there are enough saguaro cactus, there are enough red rock canyons, there are enough streams and oceans to fall in love from here to eternity and never run out. Adam and Eve were in love. Do you know the place? It's a garden where the sounds are fuller and the colors are brighter and the smells are richer and the living is better than any other place in the world. Adam and Eve were in love. One of the things in the garden that Adam loved doing more than anything else was baking bread. He'd get this big pile of dough, and he loved to bury his fist, poof, deep in that dough as he kneaded it, poof. He liked the way it folded around his wrist as he did that work. The thing that Eve loved more than anything else was taking her sigh and going out into the field and harvesting the grain. She loved the way the warm sun fell on her bare brown skin. After working in the garden, they often went for a walk with God in the cool of the day, and then sometimes after work, they would go down by this pool, this deep, clear pool where I guess we'd call it skinny dipping, but they just called it swimming. They'd go swimming, and there by the pool, Adam would often turn to Eve and say, "Eve, you are the most beautiful woman in the world." Of course, he didn't know about Halle Berry and Kate Winslet. And Adam would often turn to Eve and say, "Eve, you are the most beautiful woman or the other way. Thank you. Eve would turn to Adam and say, "You are the most handsome man in the world." Of course, she didn't know about Denzel Washington, Matthew McConaughey. I guess you could say that there was a lot that Adam and Eve didn't know. They didn't know that light could be seen either as a particle or as a wave. They didn't know that in 1971, the Pirates took the World Series. They didn't know that in '64, Miss Texas was crowned Miss America. They didn't know that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. There was a lot they didn't know, but it just didn't matter. They didn't know that Eve had this unusually large space between her 2 front teeth that could be corrected by an orthodontist for $6,500. They didn't know that Adam was supposed to be taller than Eve, or that his nose was really too big for his face. There was a lot they didn't know, but it didn't matter because they were in love. One day there was a knock at the door. They'd never had anybody knock at the door before. They didn't know they had a door. Adam got up and answered the door, and there was this tall, slender fellow with his hat pulled down low over his eyes. All you could see was this long, bifurcated red tongue lashing the air, and at his feet was this big leather case that said in gold embossed letters across it, "Britannica." Adam and Eve bought a set. And in many ways, it was a good thing. It was the door into the information age. They learned so much. Eve put away her scythe and found out she could order a Kubota tractor to help her do the gardening. Adam got a KitchenAid bread maker that helped things go faster. In lots of ways, it was an improvement to their life, but it caused some problems too. I mean, Eve would read one article and Adam would read another article, and then they'd argue about his facts and her facts. They became intellectuals. which was sort of a problem because sometimes intellectuals tend to believe that once they've thought about something, and especially once they've talked about something, they've actually accomplished something. So they started having permaculture seminars, and they forgot all about the garden. And the weeds were growing up and choking the new young plants. And they started arguing about his turf and her turf, and they forgot that the water needed to be spread around the garden, and the garden was drying up. One day they were walking through the garden, and there was that tall, slender fellow, the Britannica salesman, up in the tree with a laptop computer in his lap. And he was just typing away like crazy. And Adam and Eve couldn't help it. They were so curious, they went up and said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's an apple." And then Adam and Eve were lost completely. I mean, they spent hours and hours on Facebook and surfing the web, all the time that the garden was diminishing. There were power lines that came in, and strip malls, and Senate Bill 1070, and the Arizona State Legislature, and hate radio, and they looked around one day and they said, "What happened to the garden?" They ended up in the land of Nod, which is somewhere in Chandler, because the garden is in Tempe. And they joined the Valley Unitarian Church. Some say the only church in town where Jesus would be comfortable. And, you know, their life was happy in some ways, but sometimes they'd go for a walk in the cool of the day, which was much warmer than it used to be because of the heat island effect and climate change. They'd walk down by Mrs. McCurdy's, who had these jasmine plants and honeysuckle, and Adam would say to Eve, do you smell that? And it would remind them of some place they couldn't quite remember where. And then they'd walk down by the city park past the Quail Run Estates, named because the quail actually used to run there at one time. Down by City Park, just as the sun was setting and it was shining through this red vine maple, and it looked like it was frickin' on fire. And Eve said to Adam, "Do you see that?" And it reminded them of some time they couldn't quite remember when. But they got an urge. They got an urge to divest from fossil fuels. They got an urge to make a generous contribution to Arizona Interfaith Power and Light. Adam got an urge to bake bread, not with the bread maker, but with his own hands. And Eve got an urge to plant a garden, to distribute the seeds with her own hands. They got an urge to try to make the corner of the world where they lived just a little bit more beautiful. Love is a garden where the sounds are fuller and the smells are richer and the colors are brighter and the living is better than any other place in the world.
See, you can see why I love Doug. Wow. 98% of all the species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct today. Another way of saying that is that only 2% of the life forms that have ever lived are alive now. Now, most of that you expect. The process of evolution naturally sort of carves away species, the strongest survive, et cetera, et cetera. But throughout time, there have been these periods when mass numbers of species have gone extinct. Some scientists are telling us that this is one of those times, a time of many hundreds of species going extinct, partly because of what we're doing, of human action. One species that may soon join that list of 98% is the bluefin tuna. The bluefin tuna is in high demand, especially in Japan, for sashimi. I won't ask how many of us are sushi eaters here. But the bluefin tuna has become so rare that it's outlawed in much of the world, but in other parts of the world it's in high demand. The Mitsubishi company, which is based in Japan, has developed a strategy when it comes to bluefin tuna. First, they went about gobbling up, cornering about 50% of the world's fishing market for bluefin tuna. So half of the bluefin tuna that are caught in the world are caught by fishing fleets that belong to Mitsubishi. But they're not selling all of them. Many of the bluefin tuna that they catch, they stick in a freezer at 60 degrees below Celsius, betting on the fact that eventually bluefin tuna will become commercially extinct or endangered to the point that they can no longer be fished. And at that time, a company, say with lots of bluefin tuna in the freezer that have already been caught, could pull them out and sell them for astronomical amounts of money. There's a ceremony at the opening of the fish market in a part of Japan where the first bluefin tuna of the year is sold. Last year, a 400-pound bluefin tuna was sold for $1.3 million. I want to be able to condemn Mitsubishi. But in a capitalist society, that makes perfect sense in a way. If we're sort of fundamentalist capitalists anyway, and we're all capitalists, I mean, really. I saw, by the way, at a protest once, a kid proclaim that he was a communist and then pull out his iPhone. We're all capitalists in one way or another. But I feel like I sense what Mitsubishi's doing, that desire to pull it all out before somebody else gets it and stick it in the freezer to make money from later in myself, too. It reminds me of an old story. Confucius sitting with a few of his favorite students. And he asked them, what's your ambition in life? What is it that you want to do in the great wide world? What difference do you want to make? And one of them said, I want to be the minister of finance. Great wisdom about money, knew how to make money. These are high-achieving people, Confucius' best students. Another one said, I want to be the minister of war. Confucius' favorite answer came from his third student, who said, my ambition in life is that in the spring, I'll go down to the river and I'll swim with my friends and enjoy the breezes and return home happier. And I want to be that person who can, instead of manipulating the resources I find, can enjoy them as they are. But again, none of us is that person either. I think, rather than setting up this false sort of fundamentalist dichotomy, are you the Mitsubishi bluefin tuna killer capitalist? Or are you Confucius student who's going down to the river and enjoying the water and coming home and seems to have no job or life outside friends? The truth must be somewhere between those two things. I think that those two things are in each of us. And maybe the answer is to decide which one, as the old Native American story goes, which one you'll feed, which one we'll listen to more often.